The ground was still frozen solid when they lowered Thomas Reed into the earth, and Frances stood at the edge of his grave with her hands folded and her jaw set so tight it ached, telling herself she would not cry where the whole town of Caldwell, Kansas, could see her do it. She did not cry. It was the 14th of October, 1878, and the sky above the prairie was the pale gray of old wood, streaked through with the faintest pink along the horizon, where the sun had barely managed to heave itself above the flat line of the world. The wind came across the open land the way it always did in autumn out there, low and insistent, finding every gap in every coat, pressing against the backs of necks and slipping beneath skirt hems with a cold indifference that felt almost personal. Frances wore her good black dress, the one she had sewn herself 2 years prior for a neighbor's funeral, never imagining she would be wearing it so soon for her own husband. It fit her well enough, though the sleeves were slightly short and left a strip of her wrists exposed to the chill. Reverend Hollis read from Psalms in a voice that wavered with the wind, his pages flapping against his thumb. Around Frances stood the people of Caldwell who had come out to pay their respects. Old Mabel Dutton from the dry goods store, who had known Thomas since he was a boy. The Hargrove brothers from 2 claims over, both of them holding their hats at their chests with the solemn awkwardness of men who did not know how to stand still. Clara Finch, who had been Frances's closest friend since Frances and Thomas arrived in the territory 4 years ago, and who now stood near enough to touch her elbow if needed. The town sheriff, a man named Deering, stood at the back with his thumbs hooked in his belt, paying respects the way lawmen do, which is to say efficiently and without much warmth. Thomas Reed had been 31 years old. He had died of pneumonia, which was not a dramatic way to die and not a death that earned much ceremony, but it was the death he had gotten. 4 days of fever that would not break, a rattling cough that went from bad to worse, and then a stillness in the early hours of the morning that Frances had felt before she opened her eyes, the way you sometimes feel a sound before you hear it. She had lain beside him for a long while after, her hand on his chest, the cold gray coming through the window glass, before she rose and began the business of what comes next. What came next was considerable. She and Thomas had built their life on 80 acres of Kansas grassland, a homestead claim they had filed in 1874 under the Homestead Act, working the land together through drought and locust season, and a summer so brutal it had killed 2 of their 3 cows. They had a house, a proper timber frame house, not a soddy, which Thomas had been proud of, a barn, a smokehouse, a kitchen garden, and a root cellar. They had a daughter named Lily, who was 6 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness. They had a mule named Grover Cleveland, which Thomas had named before Grover Cleveland was anybody, so it was a genuine coincidence and a source of occasional awkward conversation in town. They had 40 bushels of winter wheat planted and coming in, which was good, and they had a woodpile that was not nearly large enough to get through a Kansas winter, which was very bad. The wood was the thing Frances kept thinking about while Reverend Hollis spoke. Thomas had planned to spend the last 2 weeks of October splitting and stacking wood. He had said so. He had borrowed an extra axe from the Hargroves in anticipation of it. He had stacked the unsplit logs against the east side of the barn, a good cord's worth of cottonwood and elm that had been drying since June. But he had fallen sick before he could begin, and the logs still sat there, round and useless, and October was already half gone and the first real cold would come by November, and she was looking at a long dark winter with a 6-year-old child, and a woodpile that could maybe keep them warm through the first 2 weeks of December if she was extremely careful about the stove. The Reverend said amen, and the men with shovels began their work, and Frances watched the first frozen clods of earth fall onto the pine box her husband lay in, and she thought, I need to find someone to split that wood. She thanked the people who had come. She accepted the casserole from Mabel Dutton and the pie from Clara Finch, and she allowed Clara to hold her hand for a long moment without pulling away, which was its own kind of grace. She gathered Lily, who had been standing beside Clara's youngest daughter, and had managed the whole morning with the wide-eyed seriousness children sometimes have in the presence of adult grief, not fully understanding it, but instinctively behaving as though they do. Frances lifted her daughter into the wagon, clicked Grover Cleveland into motion, and turned the old mule toward home. It was 8:30 in the morning. The road back to the homestead wound out of town and across the open land, following the line of a creek that was low this time of year, banks muddy and brown with fallen cottonwood leaves. Lily sat pressed against Frances's side on the wagon bench, her small body warm through the wool of her coat, and she said nothing for a long time, which was unlike her. "Mama," she finally said, "is Papa in heaven now?" "He is," Frances said. "Does he have a warm coat?" Frances looked out at the flat gold-gray prairie stretching to every horizon, and she felt something crack open in her chest just briefly before she pressed it closed again. "He does not need one," she said. "It is always warm where he is." Lily seemed to accept this. She pressed closer. Frances put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and kept her other hand on the reins, and she did not let herself think about anything except the road and the cold and the practical matter of the wood. She was 28 years old. Her hair was the dark auburn of river clay, usually pinned up and almost always escaping somewhere along the sides, and she had gray eyes that people who knew her well said held more intelligence than was strictly comfortable to look at directly. She was not a woman who had ever thought of herself as beautiful, but she was striking, in the way that women who have worked hard outdoors sometimes are, with a directness in her face and a steadiness in her hands that had nothing to do with prettiness and everything to do with being absolutely present in whatever she was doing. Thomas had called her the most capable woman he had ever known, and he had meant it as the highest compliment, and she had taken it as one. She was going to need every bit of that capability now. When she got home, she fed Lily, started the stove with the last of what she had split from a smaller stack near the porch, and then stood in the doorway looking at the barn and the logs beside it. The axe was leaning against the barn wall. She had never split wood in her life. Thomas had always done it. She had done nearly everything else on this homestead at one point or another, had driven fence posts and mended harness and delivered a calf in the middle of the night with no assistance, but she had not split wood. She was willing to try, and she suspected she would be terrible at it, and she calculated that she had time to learn before the serious cold set in, but only just barely. She was still standing in the doorway, making her calculations, when she heard the horse. She heard it before she saw it because the land was flat and the wind carried sound strangely out here, sometimes bringing a sound from a great distance before the source of it appeared. The sound resolved into a rider coming up the track from the south, the direction that cut across the open grassland rather than coming from the town road. Frances stepped back inside, reached for the rifle she kept above the door, and then stepped back into the doorway with it held at a low, casual angle that was not threatening, but was not entirely unthreatening either. The rider came on steadily. He was on a sorrel horse, a good animal with clean legs and a steady pace, and the rider himself was a tall man in a brown canvas coat and a hat that had been through some weather. He was not riding fast. He was not riding the way men ride when they are coming to cause trouble, which Frances had learned to identify by its urgency, its leaning forward quality. This man rode the way men ride when they are traveling, upright and unhurried, and he pulled up about 20 yards from the house when he saw her in the doorway. "Morning," he called. His voice carried easily without being loud. "Morning," she returned. "I am looking for the Reed homestead. I was told in town it was this direction." Frances studied him for a moment. He was maybe 30, 32 at the outside, with a jaw that had 3 days of beard on it and eyes she could not read the color of from 20 yards. He sat the horse well. His hands were easy on the reins. "You have found it," she said. He removed his hat and held it against his chest. It was an old-fashioned gesture, and it struck her as genuine rather than performed. "My name is Jonas Wallace," he said. "I rode through Caldwell this morning and I heard about your husband. I am sorry for your loss, ma'am, truly sorry." Francis watched him. "Did you know Thomas?" "I did not," he said. "I never had the privilege. I passed through Caldwell once before, about 2 years ago. I was heading up into Colorado territory then. I'm heading back south now." He paused. "When I heard what happened, I heard also that there was a wood problem." Francis straightened slightly. "A wood problem?" "The man at the livery stable mentioned it," Jonas said, with the careful tone of someone who knows they are treading close to a line. "He said your husband had planned to do the winter wood and had not gotten to it. I thought I might offer my assistance, if it would be welcome and if you would allow it. I do not have pressing business until I reach Wichita, and Wichita is not going anywhere." Francis looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved across the yard between them, picking up a few dry leaves from near the porch steps and spinning them briefly before letting them drop. The unsplit logs sat against the barn, every one of them exactly where Thomas had stacked them. "You would do that for a stranger," she said. "I have been a stranger everywhere I have ever stopped," he said, simply and without self-pity. "A man gets accustomed to it. If he is lucky, he finds ways to be useful." She looked at the logs, she looked at him. She thought about Lily inside, who needed warmth through February and into March, and she thought about the axe leaning against the barn wall, and she made the decision the way she made most decisions, which was quickly and without much ceremony. "Your horse can go in the barn," she said. "There is a water trough. I will bring hay." Jonas Wallace put his hat back on. "Thank you, ma'am." "Mrs. Reed," she said. "Mrs. Reed," he repeated, and she could hear the respect in it, the exact calibration of a man who understood what he was walking into and was not taking any of it lightly. He came into the yard and dismounted, and she saw that he was indeed tall, taller than she had guessed, with broad shoulders and the kind of long-muscled build that comes from physical work rather than from any deliberate effort toward it. He led the sorrel toward the barn with the ease of a man who has cared for horses his entire life, and Francis went back inside to check on Lily and to put on a pot of coffee, because whatever else was happening, it was a cold morning and she was not going to be inhospitable. Lily was at the table, drawing shapes in the flour Francis had dusted there from the morning's biscuits, her dark eyes serious and absorbed. She looked up when Francis came in. "There is a man outside," Lily said. "There is," Francis agreed. "Who is he?" "A man named Jonas Wallace," Francis said, working the coffee pot onto the stove. "He has come to help with the wood." Lily considered this with the profound seriousness of a 6-year-old encountering an unfamiliar variable. "Is he nice?" "I do not know yet," Francis said honestly. "He seems to be." Lily nodded as if this were a satisfactory answer and returned to her flower drawings. Francis poured 2 cups of coffee when it was ready and carried one out to the barn. Jonas was just finishing settling the sorrel into the empty stall, the second stall, Thomas's horse having been sold 2 days ago to cover funeral expenses, and he was speaking quietly to the animal in the unhurried, private way that people speak to horses when they think no one is listening. He stopped when he heard her footsteps and straightened, and she held out the cup. "Thank you," he said, and took it, and the steam rose between them in the cold barn air. She had taken a better look at him now. He was perhaps 30, she revised, maybe 31. His eyes were dark brown, the kind of brown that could look almost black in low light, and they were watchful in a way that was not suspicious, exactly, more like attentive, as if he were in the habit of noticing things and filing them away. His hands around the coffee cup were large and marked with the small calluses and scars of outdoor work. He had a scar along his jawline on the left side, old and thin, probably from a long time ago. "The logs are against the east wall of the barn," she said. "I saw them," he said. "Good dry wood. Cottonwood splits easy. The elm will take more effort. How much time do you think it will take?" He looked out toward the logs through the open barn door, making a quiet calculation she could almost see happening behind his eyes. "A day," he said. Maybe a day and a half if some of the elm pieces are knotted. Do you have a splitting wedge? The axe alone will not do for the bigger rounds. I do not know, she said. Thomas had tools. I will look. I brought my own wedge, he said. It is in my saddlebag. I should have what I need. She watched him drink his coffee. It occurred to her, with a sudden and not entirely comfortable clarity, that she was watching him quite closely for someone who had only met him 6 minutes ago. She looked away. I need to go tend to things inside, she said. Dinner will be at noon if you want it. That is very kind, he said. I appreciate it. She went back inside. The sound began about 20 minutes later. She was at the kitchen table working through Thomas's papers, the land documents, the bank note they owed on the seed purchase, the list of things that needed to be tallied and understood, when she heard the first clean crack of the axe hitting wood outside. Then another. Then the rhythm of it, steady and sure, a sound that was so entirely associated in her mind with Thomas that for one unguarded moment she felt the loss of her husband not as an absence but as a physical pressure in the center of her chest, like a hand pressing down. She breathed through it. The sound continued. She returned to the papers. Lily heard it too and went to the window and pressed her small nose against the cold glass to watch. He is very good at it, she announced. Good, Frances said. He hit it really hard. That is generally how it is done. Lily stayed at the window for a while, narrating intermittently, and Frances worked through the papers and tried to see the whole picture of what she was facing. The land was hers. The Homestead Act gave it to her as the surviving spouse, and she had 5 years total on the claim, of which 4 were done, meaning she needed only to survive 1 more year, and the land would be fully deeded to her and Lily. The banknote was manageable barely, if she sold the wheat from this season's planting and was extremely careful with everything else. The cow that had survived the bad summer was still producing, though less than before. The kitchen garden had been put up properly in jars, and she had enough preserved food to last through much of the winter. The wood, thanks to the man outside swinging the axe, would be handled. What she could not quite calculate was everything after that. She was a widow alone on a homestead with a 6-year-old child in the middle of the Kansas territory, and the world was not designed to be kind to such a woman. She knew this. She had known it the moment she understood Thomas was not going to recover, had begun running numbers even while sitting beside his sick bed, which she was not proud of but which was also simply the truth of who she was. She was capable. She was not afraid. She was, if she was honest, very lonely in a way that had very little to do with Thomas's death specifically, and more to do with the nature of the life she had built, the isolation of the homestead, the weeks that sometimes passed between real conversations with another adult. Thomas had been her companion in this, her partner in the deepest sense of the word, and she had loved him with a kind of steady, practical love that suited them both. She missed him. She would miss him for a long time. But she was also someone who could not afford to stop moving, and she did not. She made dinner at noon, salt pork and beans and the last of the biscuits from morning. She called out the door and Jonas came in, hat in hand, and washed his hands in the basin she had set out and sat down at the table across from Lily, who examined him with the fearless directness of a 6-year-old. You have a scar on your face, Lily said. Lily, Frances said. It is all right, Jonas said, touching the scar briefly with one finger. I do. Got it when I was about your age, actually. Fell off a fence I had been told not to climb. Lily's eyes went wide with the delicious recognition of someone being told they are not the only one who has disobeyed about climbing things. Did you get in trouble? Considerable trouble, he said gravely. The falling off was punishment enough, according to my mother, but my father disagreed. Lily giggled, and the sound of it surprised Frances because she had not heard Lily laugh all day, and she had not been sure when she would again. She set the beans on the table and sat down herself. They ate. The conversation was cautious at first, the way conversation is between people who are essentially strangers eating a meal together in an unusual situation. But Jonas Wallace had a quality that Frances began to notice and file away. He was a good listener. When Lily told him about the mule being named Grover Cleveland, he listened to the whole explanation, the strange coincidence of the timing, with the genuine interest of a man who finds things actually interesting rather than the performed interest of a man who is just being polite. When Francis mentioned that the wheat looked likely to be a reasonable yield this year, he asked a careful question about the strain she was growing and what the soil conditions were, and she found herself talking more than she had intended, which was unusual for her. "Where are you from originally?" she asked him when there was a pause. "Missouri," he said. "Outside of Springfield. I left when I was 18. He said it without elaboration, which she recognized as a door being left closed rather than necessarily hiding anything, just a thing a person did not want to talk about at a meal with a woman he had just met. "Why west?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "I thought there was more room," he said. "I was right about that at least." After dinner he went back to the wood, and the cracking resumed its rhythm outside, and Francis put Lily down for her afternoon rest, and then stood at the window for a moment watching him work. He had shed the canvas coat and was in his shirt and suspenders, the axe moving with a steady, experienced ease, the rounds falling apart in clean halves. He would pick up a half, set it on the block, split it again, and throw the quarters onto the growing stack against the barn wall. The stack was already impressive. By the look of it, he had done nearly a third of the total logs in the morning alone. She turned away from the window and went to find the mending basket. By late afternoon, the light going low and orange across the prairie, she heard the rhythm change and then stop, and after a few minutes Jonas knocked at the door. She opened it. "The cottonwood is done," he said. "I will start on the elm tomorrow morning. I have made a fair start on the rest today, but the bigger elm pieces need the wedge and more time." "Come in out of the cold," she said. She stepped back from the door. He came in, and she saw that he was tired in the honest, physical way of someone who has worked hard all day, not exhausted but done, the kind of pleasantly worn out that a person with a physical life knows well. There was sawdust on his shirt and a blister beginning on the base of his right thumb that he had not mentioned. "You should put something on that," she said, nodding at his hand. He looked at it as if noticing it for the first time. "It is nothing." "It will be something by tomorrow morning if you do not." She went to her medicine cabinet, a simple thing Thomas had built, 3 shelves of glass jars and cloth bundles, and found the tin of lard she kept for burns and blisters and brought it to the table. He sat down and held out his hand, and she applied the lard to the base of his thumb with the matter-of-fact care of a woman who had been the only doctor available for 4 years and had learned to treat wounds without making a production of it. His hand was warm and still while she worked, and she was very aware of the contact, which surprised her, and she set his hand down and put the tin away quickly. "Thank you," he said. "You would not be able to swing the axe properly tomorrow if I did not," she said, which was true but was not the whole of why she had done it. He stayed for supper. She had not planned this explicitly, but she had made enough stew that it was clearly going to happen, and Lily had already taken to sitting beside him at the table and showing him her drawings from the afternoon, which were mostly horses and one thing that might have been a dragon or possibly a dog. He looked at each one with genuine attention, asking her questions about what things were, and Francis watched her daughter's face bright and animated in the lamplight, and felt something complicated happening in her chest that she did not fully examine. After Lily was in bed, it was just the two of them at the table, the lamp between them and the stove warm and the wind talking against the window glass outside. She poured 2 cups of the weak evening coffee she made to stretch the grounds, and he sat across from her, and for a little while they did not talk, which was not uncomfortable. "You do not have to stay the night," she said, though she was aware as she said it that it was full dark and cold and he had done a hard day's work on her behalf. "I was planning to sleep in the barn," he said. "If that suits you. It is warm enough with the horse and I have a bedroll." She thought about what the town would make of it and decided she did not especially care and said, "That suits me." He nodded. "I will be done with the elm by tomorrow evening," he said. You will have a full winter's worth, maybe more." "Jonas," she said, and then stopped because she had used his given name without deciding to, and she was a woman who generally decided everything. He looked at her without expression but with complete attention. "Why are you really here?" she asked. She said it without accusation, genuinely. "You do not know me, you do not know this family. A man passing through who stops to split a widow's wood is not a thing that happens in my experience." He looked at the coffee cup in front of him for a moment. "It happens," he said. "Not as often as it should, but it happens." "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not." He looked up at her. "I heard what happened to you, and I thought, that is a woman alone with a child heading into winter and not enough wood. And I thought, I can do something about that particular problem." I did not think about it much longer than that. "You did not think about anything else," she said. Something shifted in his expression briefly. "I thought that I did not have anywhere pressing to be," he said carefully. "And that might be the more honest answer." She looked at him. He looked back. The lamp made shadows of them both on the wall behind, large and quiet. "All right," she said. He went to the barn. She sat alone at the table for a while, listening to the wind and the distant settling of the house timbers, and she thought about what she was feeling, which was not grief exactly, or not only grief, and which she was not ready to name yet, and so she went to bed. He was up before she was in the morning. She heard the axe before she was fully awake, the sound coming through the cold air and the walls, and she lay still for a moment listening to it. The light through the window was the thin silver of very early morning. Lily was still asleep in her small bed in the corner of the room. Frances rose quietly, put on her dress and her wool wrap, and went to start the fire in the stove and begin the morning biscuits. When she brought his coffee out to him in the cold yard, the sun was just coming over the horizon, and Jonas was already deep into the elm, the wedge driven into a particularly stubborn round, the axe coming down on the back of it with short, controlled strikes. He looked up when she came out, and his breath made a cloud in the cold air, and he took the coffee with both hands. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Reed." He looked better than he had the day before, which she had not expected, most men looking worn when they slept in barns, but he looked rested and clear-eyed. "How did you sleep?" she asked, before she thought about whether to ask it. "Very well," he said. "I have slept in worse places than a barn." "I imagine you have," she said. She looked at the stack of split wood which had grown considerably even in the hour or so since he had started. The elm was denser, darker grained than the cottonwood, and the quarters had a different weight when they fell. "Tell me about your life," she said. She said it the way she would say past the salt, practical and straightforward, and she saw a flicker of surprised appreciation in his eyes. "What part of it?" he asked. "Any part," she said. "All of it if you like. You have a long day ahead of you and talking passes the time, and I am curious." He set down the coffee and picked up the axe and began to work, and he talked while he worked, which she found she liked, the story coming in pieces between the strikes of the axe. He had grown up on a farm in Missouri with 3 brothers, his father a difficult man in the specific way of men who feel that the world has not given them their due, which makes them take it out on whoever is nearest. He had left at 18 because leaving was the only thing available to him. He had gone west because he had read about it in a newspaper, and it had sounded like a place where a man's history did not follow him if he moved fast enough. He had worked cattle drives out of Texas for several years, had worked for a surveying company in Colorado for a while, had trapped along the mountain streams in Montana one winter that he described as the coldest experience of his life and also the most beautiful. He had not stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, which he said with a kind of reflective sadness, like a man who has just heard himself say a thing clearly for the first time. "Do you want to?" she asked. "Put down roots?" He split a round cleanly in half and set down the axe for a moment. The cold air around them was sharp and clear. "I think I do," he said. "I think I have been wanting to for longer than I have been willing to admit." She looked at him. He looked at her. Then he picked up the axe again, and she collected his empty cup and went back to the house to check on Lily. The day turned out to be warmer than the one before, One of those bright October days the Kansas prairie sometimes threw out like a small gift, the sky an impossible blue and the light clear and golden. Lily came out in the afternoon and sat on the porch steps watching Jonas work, wrapped in her coat, occasionally picking up a wood chip and examining it as if it might be important. Jonas talked to her sometimes while he worked, asking her questions about the farm, about the mule, about her drawings. Lily told him at considerable length about a family of rabbits she had discovered in the kitchen garden in August, and had named and then watched, devastated, as they ate the better part of her mother's bean plants, which she recounted with the specific moral complexity of a 6-year-old who loved the rabbits but also understood that the bean plants were necessary. "What did you name them?" Jonas asked, splitting a piece of elm without pausing. "The big one was Samuel," Lily said. "The small ones were just the babies." "Samuel seems like a good name for a rabbit," Jonas said seriously. "He was not a good rabbit," Lily said. "He was very destructive." Frances, standing in the open doorway, pressed her hand briefly over her mouth to cover the smile, and then went back inside. By the time the sun began its long orange slide toward the western horizon, Jonas had split the last of the elm. Frances heard the final crack of wood, and then a silence that she recognized as the specific silence of a task completed, and she went out to look. The woodpile stacked against the barn wall was enormous, orderly, beautiful in the purely practical way that stacked wood is beautiful when you are looking at it from the perspective of winter survival. It rose nearly to the barn eaves at its tallest point and stretched along the wall in both directions. She stood looking at it for a long moment with her arms crossed against the cold. "That is more than enough," she said. "A little more than a full cord," he said. He was leaning on the axe handle, looking at the stack too. "That will carry you well past spring, even with the stove running long and cold." "Thank you," she said. She meant it in a way that simple words were not quite adequate for, which was a feeling she was not accustomed to. He looked at her. "You are welcome," he said. They stood together in the last of the day's light, the prairie extending in every direction, vast and quiet and golden, and Frances felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the simple, uncomplicated comfort of another person standing near her. Not Thomas's presence, which had been its own familiar thing worn smooth with years. Something else. Something new and careful and uncertain, like the first green in spring, which can be killed by a late frost and knows it. She looked away first. "Come in for supper," she said. He came in. He washed his hands and face in the basin while she finished the cornbread and heated the beans she had been keeping slow on the stove, and Lily set the table with the careful ceremony she brought to everything, laying each fork and cup as if placement were a science. Jonas sat down and looked at the spread with genuine appreciation, and Frances noticed that he ate the way men eat who have gone without enough meals in their lives, not greedy but attentive, tasting things properly. "Will you leave tomorrow?" Lily asked him, with the bluntness of someone who does not know yet that some questions are impolite. Jonas looked at Frances before he answered, which she noted. "I should move along," he said slowly. "I have been here 2 days." "2 days is not very long," Lily said. "Lily," Frances said. "It is not," Lily maintained. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside the wind was picking up again, a cold, restless sound against the window glass, the kind of wind that smelled of the winter coming. "No," Jonas said, 2 days is not very long." He looked at Frances, and this time she did not look away quickly. She held the look for a beat longer than she had intended, and something passed between them that was not anything either of them was ready to call by its name, but that was present there in the warm lamplight, completely real and completely undeniable. "I will leave in the morning," he said, "if that is all right." "It is all right," she said. After Lily was in bed, they sat by the stove together, and she asked him more questions and he asked her some too, and they talked for 2 hours in a way Frances had not talked since she could not remember when, not just about practical things but about the larger questions. what they believed about the land and the country and the future and the people they hoped to be. He told her that he had never been married, and he said it not as a confession but as a simple fact, and she told him about Thomas and their 4 years on the homestead, and she spoke of Thomas with honesty and affection, and without pretending to a grief that she did not feel exactly, which was its own kind of respect for the truth. He was a good man, she said. We were good partners. We were not romantic people. Thomas and we were practical people who suited each other very well and built something together that we were both proud of. I loved him, but I am not, she paused, looking at the stove. I am not someone who falls apart, she said. I do not think that is a failing. I do not think so either, Jonas said quietly. She looked at him. He was sitting with his forearms resting on his knees, the lamplight on the planes of his face, his eyes on her with that careful attentiveness she had been noticing since the first moment she saw him. I am going to be fine, she said. I want to be clear about that. I am not a woman who needs rescuing. I know, he said. I have seen you for 2 days. Then why did you come? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I told you, I heard there was a wood problem, and now the wood is done. Yes, he said. She nodded slowly. Good night, Jonas. Good night, Francis, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed it, and she went to bed and lay awake for a while listening to the wind. In the morning he was packed and his horse was saddled before she came out. She had known he would be, and she had known she would feel the particular flat sensation of something ending that she was feeling, and she made the biscuits and called him in for breakfast anyway, and they ate together, the 3 of them, one last time. Lily ate her biscuit and said nothing for once, which was the loudest thing she could have done. At the door, Jonas put on his hat and turned to face her. She had come out onto the porch and the morning was cold and brilliant, frost on the grass. If you are ever in need of anything, he said, I would want to know. How would I find you, she said. I will be in Wichita for a while, he said. The boarding house on Kishom Street, you can send a letter there. I will not need to, she said, but thank you. He mounted the sorrel and looked down at her from the horse with that dark, attentive gaze, and she looked back, and neither of them said what was actually in the air between them because neither of them had any right to yet, and he turned the horse and rode away south, and she watched him go until he was a small dark shape at the far edge of the gold grass and then gone. She stood there for a moment. Then she went in and began the washing up. She wrote him a letter 3 weeks later. She had not intended to. She had gone to Caldwell for supplies and found herself standing at the post office counter with a piece of paper and a pencil, almost as if she had arrived there without deciding to, and she had written, Mr. Wallace, I hope you have settled well in Wichita. Lily asks about the rabbits whenever she draws. We are managing well here. The wood is excellent. Francis Reed. She sent it before she could think too carefully about whether she should. His reply came within 10 days, which was fast for the mail, which told her something. Mrs. Reed, I am glad to hear the wood is serving you well. I have thought of your homestead often since leaving. The weather here is cold, but the boarding house has a good stove and Mrs. Carver, who runs it, is an excellent cook, though I suspect not so excellent as you. Lily sounds like a remarkable person. I hope the wheat harvest continues to go well. Yours, Jonas Wallace. She read it twice and then put it in the drawer where she kept important papers. She wrote again 2 weeks after that, a longer letter this time, telling him about the wheat and the cow and a coyote that had gotten into the smokehouse, and which she had chased off with considerable noise, and one poorly aimed shot from the rifle. He wrote back even longer, telling her about Wichita in the winter, which was quieter than she might expect, about a man at the grain market he had helped load barrels who had turned out to have farmed near Springfield, Missouri, within 20 miles of where Jonas grew up, which had been a strange and unexpected feeling, seeing a piece of his home surface so far from where he had left it. The letters became regular. She looked forward to them. She noticed that she looked forward to them in the mornings before she had admitted it to herself in the evenings, which was a reliable sign that something was happening. In December, she wrote him about Lily losing her first tooth, which Lily considered a major event of historical importance. In January, the coldest January Frances could remember, she wrote about a storm that had kept her and Lily inside for 4 days, and during which she had taught Lily to play checkers, which Lily had then proceeded to win at with a frequency that made Frances suspicious she was being cheated by a 7-year-old. Jonas's reply to this was so genuinely funny that she laughed aloud, alone at the kitchen table, and then sat for a moment listening to the sound of her own laughter in the house. He arrived on the 15th of February. She heard the horse and went to the window and recognized the sorrel immediately, and something happened to her heartbeat that she chose to attribute to simple surprise. She opened the door before he knocked. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hand, the February light flat and white around him, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, which was an expression of a man who has made a decision and arrived at the consequences of it. "I thought I would come and see how the wood was holding," he said. She looked at him. "The wood is holding very well," she said. "I told you as much in my last letter." "You did," he agreed. "I wanted to see for myself." She stepped back from the door. He came in. Lily, who was at the table attempting arithmetic with a piece of chalk on a small board, looked up and then went completely still with the concentrated delight of someone who does not want to express too much delight in case it changes the situation. "Hello, Lily," Jonas said. "Hello, Mr. Wallace," she said very carefully. "How are the rabbits?" "I have not seen Samuel since October," Lily said sadly. "I believe he went to find other gardens." "That sounds like Samuel," Jonas said. Frances made coffee. They sat at the table and talked about the winter and the state of the wheat and the road from Wichita, which had been rough in places but passable. She watched him while she poured and while she sat and while they talked, watching the way he held his cup and the way he looked at Lily when she spoke, and the way he was careful not to look at Frances too long or too directly, which told her exactly how much he was thinking about it. Lily went to bed. The fire in the stove settled. It was just the two of them in the lamplight, as it had been that first night and every night since in the letters. "Jonas," she said. "Frances," he said. "Why are you really here?" He set down his cup. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked up at her, and there was nothing guarded in his expression now, which was something she had not seen from him before. "Because I have been in Wichita for 4 months," he said, "thinking about you. Not in the letters, although the letters have been," he paused. "The letters have been the best part of every week I have been gone, but thinking about you specifically. About the way you stood in that doorway with the rifle at a casual angle and a completely level eye. About the way you looked at that woodpile when it was done, like you were filing it away in your inventory of things that were taken care of. About the way you talked to your daughter." He stopped. "I have not felt this way before," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not a man who says things I do not mean." The fire in the stove was the only sound. "I am a widow of 4 months," she said. "I know," he said. "This is not the correct timing," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I did not come to ask you for anything. I came because I wanted to see you. That is the honest answer and the only one I have." She looked at him across the table. 28 years old and alone on a homestead in the Kansas Territory with 80 acres and a daughter and a woodpile, and the last year of a homestead claim to finish, and a list of practical things that extended to the horizon. And here was a man sitting in her kitchen telling her, carefully and honestly and without any performance, that he had been thinking about her for 4 months. "I have been thinking about you too," she said. He said nothing. He looked at her. "I am not going to pretend I have not," she said. "I find pretending inefficient." Something changed in his face slowly, the way light changes when a cloud moves off the sun, a gradual brightening. "I appreciate that," he said, "but I am not." She stopped, organizing her thoughts carefully. "I will not move quickly," she said. "I am not someone who does things without thinking them through, and I have a daughter to think about, and I have a homestead that requires 1 more year of my undivided attention to complete the claim, and I need to be honest with you that all of those things come first. If you cannot accept that, I need to know now." "I can accept that," he said. He said it without hesitation. "You say that now," she said. "I say it because it is true," he said. I am not a man in a hurry. I have spent 12 years being in a hurry to get somewhere, and I have found it does not work. I would rather do things right." She nodded. She looked at him. He looked at her. "There is a farm for sale," she said, "about 6 miles north of here, the Hatcher place. The family went back east last fall. It is not much, but it has a house and some outbuildings, and the land is decent." She said it without inflection, as if it were simply a piece of information she was passing along. He processed this. "Is that something I should know?" he said carefully. "I am telling you about it," she said, "because I thought you might be interested." He looked at her for a long moment, reading the landscape of what she was saying, which was not exactly an invitation and not exactly a refusal, and was something more like a door held open just a fraction, letting in the possibility of light. "I might be interested," he said slowly. "Spring is a good time to look at land," she said. "It is," he agreed. "You should stay the night," she said, "and look at it tomorrow." "I will stay in the barn," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will," he smiled. It was a quiet smile, contained, not showing much, but entirely genuine, and it reached his eyes and changed them. And Francis looked at it for a moment and then looked away at the stove. "Good night, Jonas," she said. "Good night, Francis," he said, and she heard the careful joy in it. He looked at the Hatcher place the next morning and came back, and said it would need considerable work, but that the land was good and the house was salvageable. And Francis said that was what she had thought from a distance, and he said he would think about it. And she said she expected he would. And when he left that afternoon, she stood on the porch and watched him go, and this time she did not have the flat feeling of a thing ending. She had instead the tentative, careful feeling of a thing beginning. He bought the Hatcher place in March. He came back with the deed in his coat pocket and a new look about him that she could not quite describe, something settled, as if something that had been held loose and uncertain for a long time had finally been tied down. He showed her the deed at the kitchen table while Lily looked on with her chin propped on her fists, following the proceedings with deep interest. "You are staying," Lily said. "I am staying," Jonas said. "Samuel might come back," Lily said, by which Francis understood her daughter was expressing approval in the oblique way that children do. "He might," Jonas said. "I will look out for him." The spring that year was the finest Francis could remember. The wheat came in strong, and the kitchen garden was lush, and the creek was high enough that the sound of it carried all the way to the house on quiet evenings. Jonas worked the Hatcher place 6 miles up the road, clearing it and mending it and breaking the overgrown fields back into something workable. And he came to the Reed homestead twice a week to help with things that needed 2 people, mending fence lines, repairing the barn roof, moving the heavy stones that had been shifting in the kitchen garden border. They worked well together, which she had half expected, and they talked while they worked, which she had not quite expected to appreciate as much as she did. The ease of it, the way a conversation could start and stop and pick up again over the course of a long afternoon of work without any of the usual effort of social conversation. He never overstepped. He was careful about it, almost consciously, never touching her without cause, never staying longer than a natural stopping point in the work, never making her feel as if the friendship and help came with expectations attached to it. She noticed this. She was a woman who noticed things, and this was a thing she stored in the growing inventory of what she knew about Jonas Wallace. He had supper with them on Thursday evenings, which became the habit. Lily took to sitting beside him at the table and presenting him each week with whatever she had learned or discovered or made, a new arithmetic problem she had worked out, a sketch of Grover Cleveland, a particularly interesting rock from the creek bank. He received these offerings with consistent, genuine interest, and one Thursday evening in May he brought her a present in return, a small set of colored pencils, 6 of them, in a little paper wrap. Lily held them as if they were something extremely breakable and extremely precious and said, very quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Wallace," and Jonas said, "You are welcome, Lily," and Francis looked out the window at the evening prairie and felt something that she no longer made any effort to not recognize. It was June when it shifted. They had been mending the fence along the south pasture, the two of them working either side of the wire, and the afternoon had been hot and bright, the summer insects loud in the grass. She had been holding the wire tensioned while he drove the staple, leaning into it, the wire humming against her gloved hands, and when the staple was set and the tension released, she had stepped back and her boot found a dip in the ground and she lurched sideways, and his hand caught her elbow before she had even quite registered falling. His hand was on her arm and she was upright and they were close, much closer than they had been before, and she looked up at him and the look on his face was unguarded in a way she had not seen since February, the careful control of it suddenly unnecessary. She did not step back. He did not let go of her elbow. "Francis," he said. "I know," she said. He let go of her arm slowly, his hand dropping to his side. She stood still for a moment, very aware of the space between them. "It has been 8 months," she said. "Since Thomas died," he said. "It was not a question." "I do not think the timing is wrong anymore," she said. She said it carefully, precisely, as if she had been thinking about exactly how to say it for a long time, which she had. He stood in front of her with the summer prairie all around them and the wire fence receding in both directions, and looked at her with eyes that held everything. She had spent 8 months cataloging in letters and Thursday evenings and long working afternoons. "No," he said. "I do not think it is either." She reached up and laid her hand against his jaw, the left side, where the old scar was, and he stilled completely, the way a person stills when they are receiving something they have wanted so much they are afraid to move in case it goes away. She felt the warmth of his skin and the faint roughness of his beard, and then she stood on her toes and kissed him, there in the south pasture with the grasshoppers singing in the June grass, and he kissed her back with a gentleness and a thoroughness that she felt all the way through to her feet. When they stepped apart, the world was still exactly where it had been, which was not always the case with such things. He looked at her, she looked at him. His hand came up and tucked a strand of her escaped dark auburn hair back behind her ear, the gesture so natural and unhurried that she felt her throat tighten. "You are a remarkable woman," he said. "I know," she said, which made him laugh, a full and genuine laugh that she had not heard from him in exactly that register before, and she thought she would like to hear it again as often as possible. They finished the fence. They were married in September of 1879. Exactly 11 months after Thomas Reed was put into the ground on a frozen October morning. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Hollies in the small Caldwell church, and in attendance were Clara Finch and her family, Mabel Dutton, the Hargrove brothers, and the sheriff, who came this time with something approaching actual warmth. Lily wore the dress Francis had made her from blue calico, the exact shade of the October sky that had gone from gray to brilliant in the week since summer, and she stood beside her mother through the whole ceremony, holding a small bunch of dried wildflowers she had gathered herself, her face solemn and deeply satisfied, the expression of someone who has been waiting for a thing to happen and is gratified to see it come to pass. Jonas Wallace stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which was new, bought in Wichita for the occasion and still slightly stiff across the shoulders, and when Francis walked toward him down the aisle on the arm of nobody, because she was a woman who walked under her own power, and everyone in Caldwell who knew her had expected no different. He looked at her the way she had come to know he looked at things he found genuinely beautiful, which was with full attention and no effort to pretend he was not looking. She reached him. He took her hand. "Hello," he said quietly just to her. "Hello," she said. The Reverend said his words. They said theirs. When it was done and Jonas kissed her, the small congregation made the sounds that small congregations make, and Lily clapped with both hands and dropped her flowers and did not notice. They had a reception at the homestead afterward, tables brought outside in the September warmth, Clara Finch's excellent cooking spread across a long plank table, someone producing a fiddle from somewhere so that there was music, thin and cheerful, in the afternoon air. Francis danced with Jonas in the yard, which she had not expected to do, and which turned out to be entirely worth doing, because he was a surprisingly good dancer, unhurried and steady as he was at everything. And she felt light in a way she could not remember feeling in a very long time, maybe since before she had come to Kansas, before the hard years, before everything. A lightness that was not about being carefree because she had too much sense ever to be carefree, but about being in exactly the right place, with exactly the right person. Lily danced too, with the Hargrove brothers' youngest daughter, the two of them spinning each other in wide swooping circles that had nothing to do with the actual rhythm of the music, and everything to do with the pure physics of dizziness. That night, after everyone had gone and Lily was asleep, and the September moon was enormous over the flat prairie, Francis and Jonas sat on the porch steps together, his arm around her shoulders and her head tipped against his neck, and neither of them said much, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already thoroughly said. He moved to the Reed homestead in full. They talked about whether to keep the Hatcher place and decided to work both, which was ambitious but not foolish, the Hatcher land being cleared now and ready for planting, and Jonas having the skills to manage it alongside the Reed farm with Francis's help. The plan was sound. They were both practical people, and they made practical plans, and then they executed them with the combined determination of two people who had both separately survived harder things than farming 200 acres. The final year of the homestead claim finished in October 1879, and the deed to the Reed land came through in November in both their names, Francis and Jonas Wallace. And when the papers arrived, she spread them on the kitchen table and they looked at them together, her hand in his. And she felt the solidity of it, 80 acres of Kansas earth that was theirs in a way that nothing could take back. The first winter of their marriage was the easiest winter Francis could remember, not because it was mild, which it was not, Kansas in 1879 being no gentler than it had ever been, but because she was warm in ways that had nothing to do with the woodpile, though the woodpile was indeed excellent. She was pregnant by Christmas. She did not tell him right away, waiting until she was certain, which took until January, and then she told him in the morning before he went out to feed the stock, simply and directly, as she did everything. He stood in the kitchen with his coat half on and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been given something that exceeds what he had let himself hope for. "Are you well?" he said, and it came out rough, which told her how much he was feeling. "I am very well," she said, "extremely well." He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and put his arms around her and held her, not dramatically, just firmly, and for a long moment, his face against her hair, and she leaned into it. "I am going to be a father," he said, as if testing the sound of it. "You already are one," she said. "Lily called you father last Tuesday when she thought you were out of earshot." She felt him go still. Then she felt him breathing carefully, and she knew he was pressing down something that had come up very suddenly, and she rubbed her hand along his back and did not say anything else. "She did," he said finally. "She did," Francis said. He pulled back enough to look at her face, and his expression was so open and unguarded that it was almost hard to look at, the face of a man who had not expected to end up with as much as he had ended up with, taking stock of it. "Francis," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." They told Lily at dinner, and Lily received the information about a baby coming with a lengthy silence followed by a very careful question. "Will it sleep in my room?" "There will be some arrangement made," Francis said diplomatically. "Good," Lily said, with the decision of someone who has determined the parameters are acceptable, "because I can teach it things." She began planning the curriculum immediately. The spring of 1880 came in like a lion, the kind of Kansas spring that starts with mud ankle deep, and then goes to a wind that will blow the washing off the line and take the line with it. And Jonas dealt with all of this with the even-tempered practicality that Francis had come to think of as one of his essential qualities, neither cursing the weather nor pretending it was not happening, simply working with what was there. He was an excellent farmer. She had known this from the moment she saw him looking at the logs against the barn, with the eye of someone who understood wood and work and measurement, and it had proved true in everything since. He had a feel for the land that was not mystical, but was grounded in deep attention, the same kind of attention he brought to everything. And the wheat they planted that spring on both the Reed and the Hatcher acreage was the best positioned crop Frances had seen in 4 years on the homestead. He also, she discovered across the months of the winter and into the spring, had a sense of humor that came out slowly, not the performative kind that announces itself, but the quiet, dry kind that you notice gradually, finding it in the corners of things he said, and which made her feel each time she found it the particular delight of discovering something you had not been looking for but which is excellent nonetheless. She fell in love with him comprehensively and without reservation, and it felt nothing like what she had felt for Thomas, not better or worse but entirely different, the way two seasons can both be beautiful without any comparison making sense. This love was less like partnership, though they were certainly partners, and more like something she had not had a name for before, a recognition, as if she were constantly finding him where she had not expected to look. In July, on an evening of such particular beauty that the whole prairie was lit rose gold, and the air smelled of warm grass and the distant rain that had fallen 2 counties to the south, Jonas came in from the Hatcher field and found her on the porch with her hands folded in her lap and a look on her face he had learned to read, which was the look of her at the end of a long, hard day, settled and still, watching the light change. He sat down beside her on the porch steps. Baby was due in September, and she was, as she described it herself, extremely done with being pregnant, though she said it without complaint, simply as a factual assessment. He put his arm around her carefully, and she leaned against his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The wheat," she said, "and the light, and about whether the baby will have your nose or mine." "My nose is not exceptional," he said. "It is a good nose," she said. "It suits your face." He looked sideways at her. "Does it?" "I have looked at your face quite a lot," she said. "I have an opinion." "I suppose that is fair," he said, "given that I have an opinion about your face." "And what is that opinion?" He looked at her, the rose-gold light on her face, the dark auburn hair loose from its pins as usual, her gray eyes watching him. "That I have never seen anything as beautiful in my life," he said, simply and without any decoration, the way he said true things. She looked at him. Her hand came up and covered his where it rested on her shoulder, and she said, "Jonas Wallace." "Frances Wallace," he said. They sat in the evening light until the colors faded and the first stars came out, and the Kansas night settled over the prairie like something laid down gently, covering everything. Their son was born on the 4th of September, 1880, in the same house that Frances had built with Thomas Reed, and that she now shared with Jonas Wallace, and the birth was attended by Clara Finch, and a doctor from Caldwell who arrived in time to be helpful, which was a small miracle in itself. The baby came into the world with considerable opinions about it, expressed at volume, and Jonas stood in the room looking at his son with an expression that Frances, watching him from the pillow where she was extremely tired and extremely happy, thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "He is very loud," Lily said from the doorway where she had been stationed for the last hour with the seriousness of someone on watch duty. "He is excellent," Jonas said. "What is his name?" Lily asked. Jonas looked at Frances. Frances looked at Jonas. They had talked about names, had gone back and forth across several possibilities, and had not fully decided. "Thomas," Frances said. She said it looking at Jonas, checking, and he nodded immediately, no hesitation, and she saw in his face the understanding of it, that this was not a thing that competed with what they had, but was part of the whole of what the life was, all of it together. "Thomas James Wallace," she said. "Hello, Thomas James," Lily said to the baby with tremendous dignity. "I am going to teach you things." The baby, Thomas James Wallace, squirmed and announced himself again at considerable volume, which everyone took as agreement. Life on the homestead settled into a rhythm that was new, and was also the most natural thing Frances had ever known. The two farms producing together made a genuine going concern, enough that they were able to hire a hand for the harvest season, a young man named Eli Watts who was 17 and hardworking, and who treated Frances with the respectful wariness of someone who had been told she was not to be trifled with, which she found both amusing and convenient. They had two good cows now, a horse Jonas had acquired from a man in Caldwell who was giving up his claim, and Grover Cleveland, who was aging but remained stubbornly operational. They expanded the kitchen garden. They put up a better chicken coop. Jonas built a new porch railing that was sturdier than the old one, working through 3 evenings in October until it was done, and Frances brought him coffee each evening, while he worked and sometimes sat in the rocking chair he had made for her another project, produced quietly over several weeks in the barn and brought out one morning as if it had simply appeared, and they talked while he worked and the October dark came on. She thought sometimes about the day they had buried Thomas, the frozen October morning with the pale sky and the Reverend's papers flapping, and the entirely practical list of problems she had carried back from the cemetery in the wagon. She thought about how she had stood in the doorway looking at the logs against the barn wall, and how she had heard a horse. She thought about a man on a sorrel horse coming across the open grassland, hat in hand, asking if he could help with the wood. She thought about how the world is not usually arranged to give you what you need exactly when you need it, and how when it does, the only appropriate response is to recognize it and not let it go. In November of 1881, Jonas came home from a ride into Caldwell with a newspaper folded under his arm, and a look on his face that she had learned to read as him bringing her something he wanted her to see. He opened the paper at the kitchen table and pointed to a small article about the expansion of the rail line through the southern part of the territory, which would mean the nearest station was going to be considerably closer to Caldwell within the next 2 years, which meant their wheat and their other crops would have a much easier route to the broader markets, which meant significantly improved prices. "That is very good," she said. "It is," he said. He paused. "I also thought this was a good time to mention something else." She looked at him. "I found out today that the Hatcher land is adjacent to a parcel that is being released for homestead claims next spring," he said. "If we file immediately when it opens, we could extend the Hatcher land by 40 acres to the north, which would make it 120 acres combined," she said, doing the arithmetic instantly. "Yes," he said. "That is a large operation," she said. "We could do it," he said. She looked at him across the table. Thomas James was asleep in his crib in the corner, and Lily was doing her lessons at the other end of the table with the focused intensity she brought to learning, which was considerable. The stove was warm and the lamp was lit, and outside the November prairie was cold and spare and vast. "Yes," she said. "We could." He smiled at her. She smiled back. They filed for the parcel in February when it opened, Jonas driving into Caldwell before the land office even opened to be the first in line, which he was, by about 20 minutes over a man from the next county who had the same idea. They got the claim. They planted it the following spring with a mixed rotation of winter wheat and milo that Jonas had researched through the winter, in an agricultural bulletin he had subscribed to, reading pieces of it aloud to her in the evenings, in a way she found unexpectedly endearing. Lily turned 8 and then 9, and she was reading above her grade level because Frances taught her every morning for 2 hours, without exception, and Jonas had brought books from Wichita on one of his supply trips, including 2 novels that Lily consumed in 3 days and then demanded more of. She was her mother in her directness and her father's memory, Thomas's memory, which lived in her dark eyes, and she was also, increasingly, her own particular self, a child with strong opinions about literature, and a genuine gift for drawing, and an ongoing complicated relationship with arithmetic that she insisted on resolving through sheer force of will rather than any accommodation with the method. Jonas helped her with the arithmetic on Thursday evenings, with a patience that Frances thought was actually slightly better than her own. In the spring of 1883, Frances realized she was pregnant again. She was 32 years old, and it was the third spring of a marriage that had not ceased to be good even for a day since the first one, and she told Jonas the morning she was certain, the same way she had told him the first time, directly and over coffee. He put down his cup and looked at her. He had learned by now that the particular expression he wore when she gave him something he had not expected contained a whole landscape of feeling that he did not always have words for, and he had stopped trying to find words for it, just letting it be visible on his face, and she had come to love the visibility of it. "Are you well?" he said. "Extremely well," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Thomas James, who was 2.5 and had recently become mobile at a pace that kept everyone in a continuous state of low-level alert, was at that moment pulling himself up by the stove leg to investigate what was on the stovetop. And Frances said, "Thomas James, step away from the stove," without looking, because she had acquired the skill that parents of toddlers develop of maintaining complete spatial awareness of their children at all times. Jonas pulled the boy away from the stove with his free hand and settled him on his knee without releasing Frances's other hand, and Thomas James grabbed at his father's beard with both fists and pulled, which Thomas James considered tremendously funny. "Good morning," Jonas said to his son, prying small fingers loose. "Bah," Thomas James said, which was his current position on most topics. Lily came in from the bedroom still pinning up her hair and assessed the scene at the table. She looked at her parents' linked hands. She looked at her mother's face. Lily had always been observant. "Another one," she said. "Another one," Frances confirmed. Lily sat down and reached across to pour herself water from the pitcher, the efficiency of someone accepting information and moving directly to the next step. "I would like a sister this time," she said. "I would like someone who is interested in books." "Thomas James is only 2, Jonas said. "He may develop an interest in books." "He is interested primarily in pulling things off shelves," Lily said, which was accurate. "That is a kind of engagement with books," Jonas said. The second child was a girl, born in October of 1883, and Frances and Jonas named her Margaret, and Lily received her with the dignified satisfaction of someone whose request has been honored. Margaret turned out to be as interested in books as Lily could have wished, and significantly quieter about everything than Thomas James, a quality she maintained from infancy, watching the world with large, steady gray eyes very like her mother's. The farm by 1884 was something worth looking at. The combined 160 acres. They had filed for one more small parcel in 1882, and gotten it were well managed and productive. The houses on both parcels in good repair, the barns solid and stocked. They employed 2 hands now through the growing season, young men who worked well and were paid fairly, which Jonas was particular about, having been on the other side of that equation often enough in his life to know what it felt like. Frances kept the accounts herself, as she had always done, a precise set of ledgers that were the envy of their neighbors when the occasional comparison was made, and she managed the household and the kitchen garden and the food stores with the same efficient attention she had brought to every other practical matter in her life. But it was different now, the management of it, because she was not doing it alone. She had a partner who matched her, step for step, not in the same way she had matched Thomas, who had been quieter and steadier, and less inclined to any position with strong opinions, but in a way that was alive, 2 people who could disagree and argue a point, and arrive somewhere together that neither of them would have reached separately. She loved arguing with him, which she had not expected, and which she recognized as something particular to Jonas, the way his mind engaged with a problem and pushed back and genuinely reconsidered. She loved his silences too, the quality of them, not empty, but full of whatever he was thinking about, a presence even in quietness. She loved the way he still, 4 years married, looked at her when she came into a room, not dramatically, just with the full turn of his attention, as if her arrival was worth noting. One evening in the autumn of 1884, they were sitting on the new porch Jonas had expanded it the previous spring, building it out so that there were two proper chairs and a wide railing and enough room for the children to play on it, watching the sun go down over the prairie. Thomas James was 3.5 and asleep inside. Margaret was 1 and asleep in her crib. Lily was sitting at the other end of the porch with a book, reading in the last of the day's light, with the determined use of every photon that only readers in houses without much lamplight develop. The sunset was enormous, as Kansas sunsets are, filling the whole western sky with layered oranges and reds and a deep gold at the horizon that looked almost solid, and the prairie below it was every shade of gold and brown and the last green of the grasses, stretching flat and beautiful and entirely real in all directions. "Jonas," Francis said. He said, "Do you remember the first time you came here?" He looked at her sidelong. "Of course I do." "You came to split wood," she said. "I came to split wood," he agreed. "And you stayed 2 days," she said, "and went to Wichita and bought a farm." "In that order," he said. She shook her head slowly, looking at the sunset. "I think about it sometimes," she said. "The distance between that day and this one, the amount of world between them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If you had told me that morning in Caldwell when I heard about a widow with a wood problem that I was heading toward any of this," he stopped. "Would you have come?" she asked. "Faster," he said. She looked at him. The last gold light was on his face, the plains of it familiar now in a way that nothing else was familiar, all the way down to the old thin scar on his jaw that she had touched on a June afternoon in the south pasture, and which now she sometimes traced in the evenings when they were quiet together, just the habit of her fingers finding it. "I am glad you came at all," she said. "Francis," he said. "I know," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat there in the last of the light, watching the sunset do what Kansas sunsets do, which is outlast what seems possible, the colors deepening and spreading and refusing to quit until finally the sky went to indigo, and the first stars showed, and the air turned genuinely cold with the familiar authority of autumn. Lily, who had been reading quietly at the other end of the porch, closed her book without being asked, and went inside to light the lamp, the self-sufficiency of a child who has grown up understanding that things need doing and doing them. Jonas stood first and offered Frances his hand, and she took it and rose, and they went inside together into the warmth of their home, the children sleeping, the lamp coming on in the kitchen window, the woodpile against the east wall of the barn stacked and ready and more than sufficient for the winter ahead, as it had been every year since the first one. She paused in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the dark prairie and the enormous sky of stars above it, the same sky that had been there on the morning she had stood in that doorway with a rifle and heard a horse coming, and she thought about what she would say to herself on that morning if she could reach back across the 6 years between. She thought she would say, "Hold still. Look at who is coming." She went inside. Jonas was at the stove, putting on water for the evening tea, and he turned when she came in, and his face in the lamplight was her life's best landscape, entirely known and entirely sufficient and still, after everything, capable of surprising her with its particular warmth. And she crossed the kitchen and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her without interrupting what he was doing, the perfect ease of it, the complete and absolute fit of two people who have found their correct configuration. "Tea," he said. "Please," she said. Thomas James called out from his room, one of the short sounds that meant he had turned in his sleep and needed a moment of reassurance, and Jonas handed Frances the kettle handle and went to check on his son, and she stood at the stove listening to the low murmur of his voice in the next room, the specific cadence of a father talking a child back to sleep, warm and certain and unhurried. Margaret made a small sound from her crib and settled. Lily's light was on under her door, reading past when she should be, which they had both decided to allow because the alternative was arguing with Lily about it, and neither of them wanted that particular battle in the evenings. The water began to steam. Outside, the Kansas night was cold and immense and full of stars, and the woodpile was stacked high against the barn wall, and the wheat was in, and the land was theirs, all 160 acres of it, properly deeded and fully real. And in the morning there would be work to do and plans to make and a life to continue living with the steady, full-hearted, practical joy that Francis Wallace had never expected and would not now trade for anything in the world. Jonas came back from Thomas James's room and stood behind her at the stove, and she leaned back into him, and he folded his arms around her from behind, his chin at her temple, and they stood like that while the water finished heating and the night settled fully over the prairie, everything quiet and warm and whole. The long story of how they had found each other complete in all its unlikely and necessary parts, closed as a good door closes, solid against the cold, keeping the warmth inside where it belonged.